Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Kevin Hash, and we're going to talk about transgenderism in the local church. Kevin, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate you having me on. Honored to be here.
Let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin serves as the minister to students and families at Versailles Baptist Church in Versailles, Kentucky. Before his current role, he served at Burton Memorial Baptist Church in Bowling Green for over 10 years. He attended Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he received his Master of Divinity. He's married to Dana. They have 3 children, Reagan, Ryan, and Morgan. So, Kevin, we have a lot of questions. It's a challenging issue, and we want to jump right into that. But as we start, tell us about your calling into ministry and your current role at Versailles Baptist.
Yes, I grew up in Frankfort, Kentucky. I grew up at Buck Run Baptist Church and gave my life to the Lord there and committed to full-time vocational ministry at Buck Run, and immediately went to college at Western Kentucky University and was a youth minister from the time I was 18, and you could say till now.
Okay.
My life has been youth ministry, but it was interrupted by being a senior pastor for 11 years.
Wow.
So I was a senior pastor in Bowling Green for 11 years and went from being a senior pastor to being in student ministry again for the last 10 years. I just had my 10th anniversary here at Versailles Baptist. But during those 11 years, I never stopped doing student ministry. And I talked to somebody the other day. I said, student ministry is where it's at. That's where the battle is fought.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that pastors do is a lot harder if we're not doing our job reaching students and equipping parents to prepare their students for a very post-Christian culture. And so I'm back in student ministry for the last 10 years and thrilled to be there.
Kevin, how has student ministry changed in the time that you've been doing it? How's it different today than it was when you were 18 years old, just getting started?
It's dramatically different. The church was the hub of much of social activity when I was just beginning in student ministry. You had your Friday night hay rides and things, and the church was this hub for whether something fun happened in town or not. And now that's not the case. Students have their own entertainment. They have their sports and their extracurricular activities, and they really have multiple youth groups today. There's not just one youth group, which is the church. There's lots of hubs of social life, and the church isn't as much the center of that hub. And cell phones have been you can't overstate how incredibly different the landscape is because of cell phones. If you think about having a kid in the 80s or 90s, they might have one friend or 2 friends that have interesting opinions about things that a parent might put some boundaries around that person because of their influence. Well, now because the kid has a phone, they have 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 friends and influencers that shape what they believe.
Yeah.
They shape their appetite for spiritual things, or they suppress their appetite. It's the things that we dealt with in youth ministry 20 plus years ago are just dramatically different. We're dealing with mental health issues. We're dealing with online pornography, sexting. It's a very different world, and you have to keep up with it.
Kevin, thank you not only for your involvement in student ministry, but the seriousness which you bring to the role of the profession itself, and the way you care for not only students in your church, but also the larger community. So let's talk about this topic of transgenderism in the local church. What's the first thing that you want Christians to understand about this issue?
I want Christians to understand that it's an issue you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to talk about it. I think there are people who will compartmentalize this issue as a political wedge issue, and they'll think, well, that's what the culture warriors deal with. And we really don't have that option because gender theory is embedded in every aspect of our culture, from our libraries to our children's TV shows to the lunch table. You might have some boundaries around your kid in terms of what they're exposed to, but if they go to class and lunch with students who are absorbing all of these ideas, they're going to receive those ideas as well. And I think Christians need to be, they don't need to be behind 5 or 10 years on this conversation. And I want them to know also, studying this doesn't mean you're a culture warrior.
Right.
It just means you're being prudent in how to shepherd your family in a very, very different world than the parents grew up in.
So you've been digging into this topic for a few years now. Why have you given so much thought and attention to the matter of transgenderism?
I think it's all because I like to keep up with what's going on in culture. Because of my personality, I was interested in it. But in our town, which is on the suburbs of Lexington, it's here. The people are confused about the issue. People are making decisions based on their opinion on it, and it's if you're in student ministry, you have to know this.
Mm-hmm.
We had a situation, it was long before COVID, where a teenager came to church with her dad. Bless his heart, this poor dad. Yeah. She came to church, and she really did not come to church to worship. She came to debate with the pastor. And you could tell that she came in with an agenda, and I kind of was interceded between our pastor and said, let me talk to this young woman. And we talked for 2 hours after church one day, and she had a whole list of questions that she had prepared, ready to trip up the pastor or box him. She wanted to debate. And it was amazing. This young woman, who probably never made a B in her life, she identified as non-binary, she identified as asexual, and we had an amazing 2-hour conversation where I tried to help her as best I could, and it was a defining moment for me, because this young woman, and she referenced her dress, and she said, I'm non-binary, and I said, you look like you're dressed to go to a job interview. I don't know what makes you think that you're dressed like a non-binary person. And then she said, well, I'm asexual. And I said, well, then we talked about her life. She said, well, I'm not interested in romantic relationships. And I would ask her, so you make straight A's? Yeah. Are you on a sports team? Yeah, I'm really good. I said, is it possible that you're just focused on really good, healthy things right now? Yeah. And maybe there aren't very many good prospects at your school. And I really pleaded with her in that on the cuff. Didn't know I was going to have that conversation waking up that morning, but I just encouraged her to please resist any label, because everybody wants a label. Everybody wants an identity. And I really encouraged her to not think that her clothes equals an identity, or her preferences as a 16-year-old is her identity, the box that she's going to live in the rest of her life. It turned out to be a very cordial conversation, and I hope that she believes that I was for her. Yeah. But from that point on, more and more things came up personally in my sphere of influence with student ministry, and I knew I needed to catch up.
So, Kevin, give us the lay of the land right now. What trends are you seeing regarding the conversation about transgenderism today?
I think we're starting to see a little bit of pushback. I think gender theory, some of the gender ideology kind of ran amok, because it came under a Trojan horse of be nice. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to be nice. Everyone wants to be nice. And for many people, it seemed like an obscure thing to argue about. And so many people just said, well, I'll just keep doing my own business. And while they did that, ideology just kind of kept saturating everything. And now we're at a point where it's affecting bathrooms and sports participation, and it's affecting how reality is defined. What is a woman has now become what is a female. Mm-hmm. The landscape is that a coalition of very interesting allies have begun to push back. You have certainly your evangelicals, but you also have biologists, mm-hmm. and you have feminists, and even LGBT advocates have kind of awoken
Mm-hmm.
and said, this ideology isn't very progressive, it's actually quite regressive. And there's a lot of unintended consequences for the blank check we wrote to just be perceived as being nice. And it's a battle. It's a battle that's not just here. In America, it's definitely a right versus left, Democrat versus Republican. In Europe, it's far from that. It's not even the Republicans or conservatives or religious people. In Europe, it's generally a battle of ideas, not just tribes.
Kevin, when you say it's regressive, how do you mean?
Well, if you think back to the 70s and 80s, there was a time when people would say, there's no wrong way to be a woman, or hey, you don't have to love pink and you don't have to love dresses to be a girl.
Right.
And that was fairly healthy because there's lots of people who have lots of interest in those things. And to be a boy doesn't mean you have to love hunting and you don't have to love
Right.
all the stereotypically masculine things. And what gender ideology has done is it's gone backwards. Anytime you see a TV show or a broadcast of a young trans-identifying child, it always comes back to stereotypes. So it's gone backward. You'll see a parent say, well, my son really likes pink, or my daughter never liked dresses. And that was the first clue that maybe they're trans. And so that's really backward. In fact, sometimes if you go on social media, if you do the hashtag Save the Tomboys, you'll find a lot of interesting conversation because there's a lot of women in their 40s and 50s who would say, I'm so grateful that I wasn't a child today because I had space to be my own kind of female, a rough and tumble tree climbing female.
Yep.
But today I would have been told, oh, you're showing the signs of being, maybe you're born in the wrong body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very regressive. And it's also regressive to redefine science. There's a, I believe it's a Transformer cartoon of all things. And there's a conversation between a robot and a young female. And the robot is intrigued about her identity. And she says, I'm non-binary. And the robot says, that's an interesting word. What does non-binary mean? And she says, non-binary means I'm neither male nor female. And so it's regressing to the point where we're redefining science and reality. And that's where you don't have to be a conservative evangelical to be concerned about that. Mm-hmm. It's very much a moving target because 10 years ago, people would very smugly say, well, sex is one thing and gender is another. Well, that's out the window. Mm-hmm. Because the culture war and the culture game is a war of words. And so you may have noticed that now people are saying, what is your sex assigned at birth? Mm-hmm. That's a way of gaslighting. It's a way of saying, well, nobody has any idea what your sex is. We'll find out. We'll find out what your gender is when you tell us down the road.
Right.
It's all very regressive. It is insane. And I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of sane people in the world who are kind of getting it.
Kevin, I understand there's a mental health condition called gender dysphoria, and lots of us hear that term thrown around. Can you explain kind of what that means?
Yeah, traditionally, before it was called gender dysphoria, it was called gender identity disorder, and so it was under the diagnostic for mental health. It was a mental health condition, and it evolved from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, still in the diagnostic manuals for mental health, but they changed the name to make it feel a little bit less of a judgment on someone's mental status, obviously. And it has evolved from gender dysphoria to you're just a trans kid. Mm-hmm. But to answer your question, when someone's sex and their perception of who they are doesn't harmonize well. Somebody doesn't feel like a boy. Mm-hmm. Somebody doesn't feel like a female, even though their body may be biologically female. And so historically, just to give you the landscape on that, historically, talking 40, 50 plus years, people with gender dysphoria were largely young boys, and sometimes grown men. Overwhelmingly, that was the case. And in the last 15 to 20 years, what used to be the majority males that dealt with it is completely flipped, and it's a majority females who identify as trans or say they have gender dysphoria, and that's sociologically and culturally notable. It's frustrating that journalists have such lack of curiosity about that, because it is a craze. Abigail Schreier, in her book Irreversible Damage, talked about the craze that's capturing many of our teenage girls, and it really is. Like, this is something that is culture generated. I don't think we have a bunch of kids who all of a sudden are realizing this incongruence with their body. I think it's both and.
Right.
You probably do have young kids who genuinely had that conflict within them, and that's always been the case. What hasn't always been the case is tween and teen girls. I mean, it's 400 in England, where they have better statistics on healthcare. 400% spike in young people who are looking for the type of intervention to change their identity. 400% spike.
Yeah, and it has also always been the case where grown-ups were willing to jump on the bandwagon and be cheerleaders for a child who is expressing confusion. How much of all this do you think has to do with the social media, peer pressure that kids are facing that way?
I think the social media is definitely speeds this up. I mean, there's multiple elements in this. One is you have lots of grown-ups in positions of influence and authority, from counselors to people in charge of education, and you have social media. So kids are absorbing some weird stuff online, and those weird things are being confirmed by grown-ups who really should know better.
Yeah.
There's any craze that happens is going to happen faster with social media. And so if you think about the anorexia of the 80s and 90s, you know, that was a contagion. That was a contagion. And can you imagine if we had TikTok and Instagram and social media then, it would have exploded even more. And so I think there is an overlap between the contagion element of this, and it's so much faster because of social media. And I think it's persisting longer because people in authority are blessing it. I mean, from the highest office in the land to your librarian. No kid is thinking this is some sketchy, weird thing that I'm picking up online. People who are in authority are cheerleading it and applauding it. And so I think we're going to have this for a while, until that bubble of affirming this craze pops.
Kevin, let's talk about application a little bit. So what's your best advice why don't we start with parents? What's your best advice to parents who have a child who's experiencing gender dysphoria, or asking questions or giving indications that they're wanting to identify as a different gender than their biological gender? What's your best advice to parents, and then your best advice to church leaders?
I think the conversation I'm having most often with parents is to be proactive, introduce some of these ideas to your children sooner, so that you can inoculate them to what they see and absorb online. I think with all three of my children, and I'm not an infallible example of how to do this, okay?
Right.
I can just tell you what I did. We had these conversations early on, and how that played out for my kids was they would see arguments online, or they would see memes and things, and their default response is, this is insane. This is crazy. How could anyone believe this? and it's not helpful. It's not good for flourishing. They get these things because we preemptively talked about these things. And what I'm seeing sometimes is you have parents who assume that this is some out there issue and no reason to talk about it, and their kid, they have this phone, and before you know it, you have a 14, 15, 16-year-old who, the most common thing that they're dealing with isn't that their kids are identifying as the other gender. The most pressing thing for Christian parents is your kid believing that the church gets this wrong will have impact for the gospel.
Right.
If the world can convince your kids that you're not nice, you're mean, you're not safe, you're not trustworthy, then that will spill over into whether they listen to you on other things.
Yeah, it's true.
And that's true whether it's gender or sexuality. And so parents have got to give a better picture for God's design for male and female, and that's a good design, and it doesn't have to be yoked to rigid stereotypes, but they need to have this conversation so that when the world throws something peculiar at them, it doesn't shake them. It doesn't shake them. I've been kind of a church dad to some kids and who are far off or who've been in this pathway. I know with my tactic has been with a young person who says they identify as non-binary or asexual or whatever, to quickly encourage them to pause that identity, pause that badge. There was a girl who I was very, very invested in, and I saw on Instagram she changed her name, her pronouns, all these things, and I met with her, and she came to youth group fairly regularly, and I met with her, and I said to her, I said, could you just humor me? Can you give me 4 months? Clear out your pronouns, clear out your bios, and just identify as a child of God for just a while. Just pause that. And she agreed. She agreed, and she kept coming, and we talked through many of the encounters that Jesus had, the demoniac, and who cut himself, and this was a girl who cut, and we talked through what are some of the cultural things that make this appealing to you, and that's something that we probably do need to talk about, because if your kid is a bit awkward, if they're maybe on the autism spectrum, they struggle with low self-esteem, they are going to be drawn like a magnet to some of these things. And so for some parents, maybe legitimately there's not a concern that their kid's going to identify as that. For many teenage girls, church girls, maybe the issue isn't that they're going to identify as the other gender, but the issue may be that they decide that the church is so wrong that I'm going to dismiss other things. However, if you're a parent whose kid is on the spectrum, is a bit quirky, awkward in their body, then you need to have a special attention to affirming them early and often as a child of God, affirming that there's all kinds of shapes and sizes to people, and God designed you a certain way to do great things through you. But that conversation is great to have early on. And I would add to this conversation, and I've had this conversation with people, is there are other elements we haven't even brought up that are affecting this. Many of the young people and most of them are girls, most of them are teen girls, most of them are white girls, most of them are upper or middle class girls. And many of these girls have absorbed this idea, and I don't want to get in the weeds on this, but there are many teenagers, because of social media, they believe they are the bad guy. Their race is problematic, they're oppressors, or whatever. So there's an interesting dynamic here where if you're somebody who's become kind of socially conscious, maybe social justice has become your bag lately, but you don't want to be the bad guy. A girl can go from being a middle-class white girl to a celebrated victim by simply changing her pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
A girl who maybe was not noticed, who maybe felt invisible, all of a sudden becomes a part of a movement, a political and ideological movement, and they find value in that.
Mm-hmm.
They find value in that. And we have a better story. We have a better movement in the gospel and in through the Church of Jesus Christ. But it's complicated. As you can see, there's so many different ways you can go with it. But there's a lot of elements that are coming together to make this an issue that you really, really can't ignore.
So Kevin, real quick, at what age do you recommend parents start having some of these conversations, body image affirming? God's going to work through you individually as an individual. At what age do you recommend a parent start having those conversations? And then what's your best advice for church leaders on addressing this subject?
I wish I could pull the names of the books off the top of my head, but I know there are books that are being written, children's books that are being written about God's good design for bodies.
Yeah.
And again, I wish I could pull them off the top of my head.
No worries.
But there are good books. I would say from a very early age, go ahead and find books about that. There's a reason why activists want to be in libraries,
Mm-hmm.
because they want to calibrate reality from an early age, and parents need to be giving them truth at an early age. So I think you don't have to deal with transgenderism as a preschooler, but you can share books about God's good design for boys and girls. And I've seen some books out there that talk of, there's pictures of girls climbing trees and boys painting, and those are good things.
Mm-hmm.
because we don't want them to at some point reach an age where I don't want to play football. If a boy doesn't want to play football, he doesn't want to play baseball, doesn't want to do this, doesn't want to shoot a gun, and the culture might snatch that kid to feel like, well, I don't want to do boy things, so maybe I'm not a boy. So have the conversation about stereotypes, and I would also encourage parents, be careful. I know it's politically correct to talk about politically incorrect, religiously correct to encourage manliness, but I don't know that we're doing young boys a favor if we create a very sharp box
Right.
for what it means to be a boy.
Yep.
We had Sam Albury here at our church, and that's one of the things we're doing as a church. So we're resourcing our parents. Mm-hmm. We brought in Sam Albury, though gender isn't his issue, but he's good on the issue.
Right.
He talked when he was with us about his childhood when he was in church. The boys would go off and do the sports things, and he wasn't at ease with that.
Yeah.
And if he would stay with the women and have conversations, and they would do, their crafting and things like that. And he said, if I was younger today, or I would feel like I must be the wrong kind of boy.
Mm-hmm.
We would have all those conversations. Books are good. I would expose young people, teenagers, to good accounts that are addressing these things. Rebecca McLaughlin has a book called Secular Creed, which has a very good chapter on this issue, and it's a heart and head issue. Mm-hmm. Head issue, and I would encourage parents and church folks. You got to realize that just quoting a verse isn't enough. You've got to give them a story of God's better, loving plan for this. The days where we could just say, it's right there. You see, Jesus said God made them male and female. Many of the young people today will nod their head and say, yeah, I see it there, but what the world is telling me feels more loving than what you're telling me. Mm-hmm. So parents are going to have to really do the heart work and the head work to show this better story of God's plan for humanity.
Kevin, thank you for giving leadership to this issue, and for being a leader. Whenever you step out in something, there's always a risk personally. So this platform is called Leadership Lessons. Let's conclude with this last question. Tell us about an experience that has shaped your approach to or understanding of leadership.
Can I tell you a story about this?
Please, absolutely.
A few years ago, a mother reached out to me. Her daughter played a sport in middle school, and wonderful, amazingly awkward girl.
Yeah.
And an unchurched family, and her daughter got in this little cluster of influence where that cluster was going to identify somewhere on the LGBT umbrella. Mm-hmm. And the mom, while not a church-going person, knew that there was a flag. Something's not right here. Mm-hmm. And she reached out to the Christian moms on the sports team that she was on, and those Christian moms connected her to me and our church. Wow. And she ended up going to Crossings Camp with us. Wow. Where she was loved on and told how much Jesus loved her despite all the things that she's done, all the things that there was a man named Jesus who wanted her as she is. And she believed that Jesus loved her and wanted her, and she gave her life to Jesus Christ and was baptized, and she is flourishing in her life. And my lesson to leaders is everything is a potential on-ramp to the gospel. Yeah. It isn't just a political thing. And one of my burdens and let me give you my concern for pastors. Pastors don't need to let the secular right decide how we talk about this issue. Right. I think when we don't talk about it, the default is going to be your Matt Walsh's, for good or bad. Yep. Your Ben Shapiro's, there's some atheist thinkers out there. Right. And they say good things and they say true things. My encouragement to church leaders is do your own work and don't let your work be divorced from the gospel. Yeah. Because we have a better answer than secular conservatives. Absolutely. And so don't outsource your best arguments, your mic drop arguments, your own the lib arguments to those people, because that's not going to work. That's going to work with your audience. But when you're face to face with a kid who's been digesting Instagram and TikToks, they don't care. They want to know that God loves them, and they want to know that God has a better plan for them than the alternate plans that they've been fed. And so study the issue, but make sure it's tethered to the gospel.
That's outstanding. Kevin, thank you for your leadership in the Great Commission in Kentucky and doing that, especially through student ministry. And thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Oh, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.